In this video, we go back, all the way back in time, to the core of all animation. The 12 basic principles of animation. They were originally created by a couple of Disney animators in 1981. And ever since then, they've been the core of all animation education. These 12 principles revolutionized art into a whole new dimension. They granted artists the ability to move through time. But despite their significance, as a self-taught animator, I never learned about these principles. I mean, I'd heard rumors about them, but I never spent any time practicing any drills. All my animation results are just trial and error. I never had any formal training. I simply looked up a YouTube video on how to animate in Photoshop and figured it out from there. But it's about time that I go back and fill in the cracks of my knowledge. At the end of the day, my goal is to get better. And if these 12 basic principles of animation can help me get there, why wouldn't I take advantage of them? So let's dive into the first principle of animation: squash and stretch. But before we get into it, I'm going to combine this one with number 3, arcs. The reason I did this is because I want to do a drill where I have a ball bouncing. And while I could just have the ball bounce straight up and down, I'd much prefer to animate something a little more dynamic. Alright, so first let's talk about squash and stretch. The goal is to illustrate the bouncy nature of the ball. First, we'll compress the ball in the direction that it's traveling. This highlights its speed and adds more movement to the whole animation. We then move to the squashed ball on the ground. This one should be pretty self-explanatory. We're just illustrating the shockwave moving through the ball. Combine that with some clean arcs and you have a very nice bouncing ball. Another thing to point out is that as the ball moves across the screen, we want it to slow down. This is highlighted in both the arcs and the squash and stretch. For the arcs, it's pretty obvious because the arcs get smaller as we go along, but you also have to include the squash and stretch because if you don't dwindle the movement, then the ball will appear way too bouncy or not bouncy enough. My example is a little rough, but I think you get the general idea. Now, moving on to our second principle of animation, straight ahead and pose to pose. This is one of those principles that really applies to your whole animation process. Straight ahead animation is when you go from one frame to the next, whereas pose to pose animation involves drawing 2 separate keyframes, and then filling in the gap with in-between frames. There's no right or wrong answer, it simply depends on what project you're working on. Let's say you're trying to draw a flame. The easiest way to go about this is to simply start drawing in different flame shapes and letting the timing of the whole animation add to the variation of the frames. Whereas if you wanted to draw a character going from one position to another, you're gonna want to use pose to pose animation so that your character's proportions line up. Almost every animation project involves a combination of both of these. But for all the animations that I'm doing in this video, I'm going to be using straight ahead animation. Now moving on to number 4, exaggeration. This is one of the most important principles because it adds life to all your animations. Whether it's slowing down before impact or creating an extreme facial expression, exaggeration is at the core of what makes animation so appealing. I could talk for hours about specific examples, but I think you get the general idea. So next up is anticipation. This represents a slight movement in the opposite direction of your animation. This causes your brain to get prepared for a movement. By acting like a dam that's holding back water, your brain is anticipating the pressure that's building up in the frames. And this causes the movement to seem a lot faster than it otherwise would. This is one of those principles that's again very, very important. Without a good understanding of anticipation, your animations are going to seem boring. Now for this next principle of animation, follow through and overlapping action, I decided to draw one of my biggest fans, Chicken Man. In this clip, I animate his reaction to him noticing he could subscribe. And guess what? You can too. It really helps me out, and if you enjoy my content, there's no reason not to. So back to Chicken Man and our sixth principle of animation. In the beginning of this scene, his hair moves with his head. And then at the end, the hair moves with the momentum and has to settle back down. In the beginning of the scene, if Chicken Man's hair had followed slightly behind the turning of his head, that would be considered overlapping action. Whereas when Chicken Man's hair settles after being moved, that's follow-through action. This is one of those principles that I personally really struggle with. It might just be my lack of experience, or just the difficulty of lagging something behind, but as far as these 12 principles go, I feel like this is definitely one of the most difficult. Next up is secondary action. This typically refers to an action that happens as a result of the first action, but it can also be interpreted as the action that's just less important. In this scene I'm drawing, I'm illustrating a rock or a meteor smashing into the ground. The secondary action are the pieces of the rock that go flying away. We all know that without the secondary action, this animation would be really boring. This secondary action is heavily tied to the follow-through and overlapping action. The same principles apply for both, but I feel like the secondary action is just a lot easier to understand. And next, we have solid drawing. At first, I didn't really understand what this was, but then after a little bit of research, I kinda understood. You see, solid drawing is actually just your shape representing a 3D image. And you can imply this with shadows and shading, but it also refers to how your shape moves across the timeline. At the end of the day, 2D animation is, well, 2D, but it's how you illustrate it to be 3D that we call solid drawing. This is something you've probably already been doing, even if you're just doodling on a notepad. This is one of those skills that's super easy to get into, but difficult to master. A master of solid drawings is able to take any shape and make it move in a three-dimensional manner. I can't even begin to tell you how difficult this can be. But thankfully, our next principle, staging, is a lot easier. But just because it's easier doesn't mean it's easy. Backgrounds typically take a long time to draw, and while they typically don't move, there are some exceptions. You see, staging doesn't just have to do with the backgrounds, it also has to do with the light on your subject. You see, staging is about the environment that your subject is in. Your staging could be as basic as some of my animations, or as complicated as some scenes from Kung Fu Panda. But let's move on to the next two principles. Principles 10 and 11. Slow in and slow out, as well as timing. You can probably guess why I combine these two together, and the reason is that slow in and slow out are a form of timing. In this illustration, I draw a ball moving back and forth, and they both have the same number of frames. This is where something fascinating happens. The ball on top appears to be moving faster than the ball on the bottom. But why is that? The answer is slow in and slow out. By manipulating the time spacing between each of the frames, we can make an object appear to move faster or slower depending on what we want. Slow in and slow out enables us to make a more natural movement and helps our brain to process when something is moving. But timing goes a step further. You see, timing is just, well, it's timing. If you're making a walk cycle, you have to time everything properly, in addition to the arcs for the arm movement or how the head bobs up and down. Timing is important in every animation, regardless of what you're doing. Just like our 12th and final principle, appeal. This is one of the most important aspects of animation, and yet it's quite underrated. Let's look at two examples. First, we have Beavis and Butthead, probably some of the worst drawn characters I think I've ever seen. And yet, the show went on to be a wild success. And now let's look at Family Guy. Both these shows incorporate loads of comedy in their work. And the difference between these two is that Family Guy you can watch for hours. Beavis and Butthead, you can really only watch for a few seconds before you get completely disgusted. But this is in the realm of comedy, where weird things are oftentimes accepted. But if you made an animation like Jujutsu Kaisen with Beavis and Butthead type animation, there's no way it would be popular. And that's why appeal is so important. And with that, guys, I'm sorry that this audio quality was a little bit off. I was sick this past week and this was the best I could do. But if you still enjoyed the video, be sure to subscribe. And with that, guys, I hope you learned something, and I'll see you in the next video.